Okay, so in this unit we are going to talk predominantly about ancient Egypt. We're also going to talk about the kingdom of Kush. So one of the things to keep in mind in this class and in most history or art history classes is that lots of things are happening in different areas at the same time. So while I go fairly chronologically within each unit, we kind of back up at the beginning of each unit and go check on what was going on in other parts of the world. So we don't back all the way up to like the Paleolithic, for example, but some of the things happening in the Neolithic section of early days overlap with what's going on in ancient Egypt and the kingdom of Kush, and also in the prehistoric Aegean. So that's just something to keep in mind. And like later in the class, when we get into the Byzantine and the early medieval, and there's some overlap in things. Okay, so anyway, this is going to be a really quick little introduction to some things about this unit. Okay, so let's get into it. Generally speaking, we're going to go through the history of Egypt in this unit following this kind of prescription. So some general information, that's what this lecture is about. Then I'm going to have a little lecture on the gods and goddesses. And then we're going to get into the pre-dynastic and early dynastic. Then we get into the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, then the Akhenaten and Amarna period, and also then the Kingdom of Kush, which is also called Nubia. Okay, so this is one of the units in this class where I have a lot of students come in with some pre-existing knowledge. So just think for a minute, when I say ancient Egypt, or Egypt, what comes to mind? You probably have some things that come up in your head when I say that. A lot of times people say things like the pyramids, we're going to talk about those, the Sphinx, mummies, maybe you've heard of King Tut or Cleopatra or the wonderful Brendan Fraser movie, The Mummy. There's a lot of things that people tend to kind of know about Egypt, but maybe you don't know the full history, you don't know exactly how they relate to each other or where they fit in the sort of timeline of art history. So we're going to go into it deeper. But you maybe have a few things like hieroglyphics, maybe you've heard of that. Okay, so you just think to yourself for a second, what do I know about Egypt? And then we can see where everything sort of fits in as we go through this unit. Firstly, I want to talk really quickly about an important piece of art history and history and archaeology that is kind of why we know so much about Egypt. So this thing is called the Rosetta Stone. And you might have heard of this before. It is also a software about learning languages, which makes sense, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But I just want you to know what this is. This is why we are able to decipher hieroglyphics. So hieroglyphics was the kind of writing that ancient Egyptians used. They were kind of like little pictures, little pictograms. So if you look closely at this, the upper third of this is hieroglyphics, okay? So this thing is divided into three sections. So we have our hieroglyphics at the top. In the center section, we have a language called Demotic, D-E-M-O-T-I-C. And then in the bottom, we have Greek, okay? So Greek is a language, ancient Greek is a language that scholars have deciphered long ago and know how to read that. And what was discovered between scholars was that all three of these sections say the same thing. Say the same thing in three different ancient written languages. So it's become this kind of key to understanding ancient languages, to understanding and being able to read hieroglyphics, particularly. So that's pretty cool. It also has kind of an interesting history. So it's discovered by a team led by someone you've maybe heard of, but maybe don't think of in terms of archaeology very often. And the team is Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon, the great French leader, conqueror who ends up being exiled and all of that kind of stuff, that guy, he leads a team in 1799. It's a military campaign. They're not going there to discover knowledge. They're going there to take over Egypt. But he took scholars with him. In 1804, they published a description of Egypt, which is this groundbreaking work. It's literally called Description of Egypt, is the name of the writing. And the specific scholar who discovers this and kind of figures out what a significant breakthrough it is named Pierre-Francois Bouchard. Okay, and this the Rosetta Stone currently lives in the British Museum, which, as we move through various ancient cultures, you're going to discover that the British Museum has a lot of things. They have an exhibition on now. It is October 2022 when I'm recording this, and they have a special exhibition at the British Museum right now that centers around the Rosetta Stone and talking about how it unlocked a lot of secrets and how important it is to archaeology, which is pretty interesting. They're also in the middle of a lawsuit right now with the Egyptian government because they want the Rosetta Stone back. They want a lot of their cultural heritage that was taken by British archaeologists and people to be returned. So it's a very interesting kind of artifact in contemporary times as well. Okay, so I just want to get the Rosetta Stone up at the top here so that we understand how we know so much about Egypt and how their language was deciphered. So there's a lot of kind of important basic things that I want you to understand about Egypt before we get into the gods and goddesses and then get into the art and architecture. One of the things is just simple geography. So Egypt is in northern Africa, right? We know where Egypt is. And one of the things that's very central to the culture and the history of Egypt is the Nile River, one of the largest rivers in the world. And it's kind of a strange river, okay? So most rivers tend to flow north to south. That is not the case with the Nile. The Nile flows south to north, which makes the terminology related to positioning in Egypt sort of confusing. So Upper Egypt means upriver, which is where the head of the river is, where it starts. That is south. So Upper Egypt is the southern half of Egypt. Lower Egypt, which is like the delta, the very end of the Nile, where it branches out into this delta that's sort of shaped like a papyrus flower or a lotus blossom, both of which are used in their artworks. So this papyrus-like shape, the delta part where it flows out into the Mediterranean Sea, that's downriver, so that's Lower Egypt. So northern Egypt is Lower Egypt, southern Egypt is Upper Egypt, which I know is kind of confusing, but just so you know, it's because of the river. And then it makes sense that the divisions of the country are based around the Nile, because the Nile and its floodwaters support all of the life in ancient Egypt. Like it wouldn't have been able to be populated by people without the Nile. It's really the backbone, and it was kind of central to all of the culture and has a lot to do with what's happening in ancient Egypt. Originally, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get into pre-dynastic, the king of Upper Egypt wore a white canonical crown that's kind of looks like a bowling pin actually, and the king of Lower Egypt wore a red crown that kind of goes like this and then has like a little projection that comes off it. And when we look at King Namir's palette, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, anyway, it is the longest river in the world. It runs south to north. It is tricksy. So, thing one. Other things that are very important to Egypt, just in general. Life after death is very important in the ancient Egyptian culture. Glorifying the gods while you are alive, paying adequate tribute to them is important so that you will have a good afterlife. Kings, which are called pharaohs at different points in Egyptian history, are seen as divine entities. They are kind of the intermediaries between gods and humans, and many of them are deified after death. So they become gods after they die, just because of their role as pharaoh is already considered a kind of holy role, basically. Another thing that's really important to their culture and to understanding their culture is the concept of Ka, K-A. Sometimes this is translated into English as Ba, B-A. I see it more often as Ka, so we're going to go with that. So on your quiz, when I ask you about this, I'm looking for Ka. K-A, okay? And that means like a life force or your essence, or kind of like the Western concept of a soul, okay? So the Ka is very important. It exists eternally. It goes on after your body dies. And in the afterlife, you want to provide comforts for your Ka in the next life. So thus we have these many artifacts that are buried with people in their tombs. So whenever people are excavating tombs in Egypt and they find all these treasures and these papyrus scrolls and all of these different kinds of things, those are there for the Ka so that it has those things in the afterlife, okay? So life after death, very important. Kings are divine. Ka is your life force or soul. Okay, another really important document to understanding Egypt and thus understanding their culture and their how it relates to their architecture and art is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They just call it the Book of the Dead, obviously. So, what is the Book of the Dead? Well, this was written on a papyrus scroll, okay, and it's found in the tomb of a guy named Hunefer. Hunefer is from the New Kingdom, so he was around 1450-ish, and he was the scribe for Seti I, Seti the First. So he himself was not the king, but he had a really high up position. He's the guy who did all the writing for this pharaoh, Seti the First. If you ever saw the Brendan Fraser movie, The Mummy, the guy who is the pharaoh in like the kind of flashback parts of that movie is Seti the First. It's not historically accurate, so you don't necessarily need to pay a bunch of heed to it, but it is a great movie, I think. So anyway, Seti the First. Okay, so this is his scribe, his guy who writes all this stuff down, and in his tomb with him is a perfectly preserved papyrus scroll that has the Book of the Dead. Okay, so what is the Book of the Dead? Why do we care about this? Well, it's a collection of spells, prayers, and other accoutrements that need to be secured or performed to have a good afterlife. So it's kind of an instruction manual for what happens after you die, what happens to your Ka, and how to make sure that you have the good afterlife and what kinds of deeds and what kinds of things you need to do. And it's all about the transition to the afterlife. So the gods play quite heavily in this description. Okay, so next I'm going to do a video where I talk about the various gods and goddesses that are pertinent to our study of ancient Egypt. And I will record that one next. All right.